That voice scared me, y'all. I'm sorry. Every time. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Please feel free to drop your name, your pronouns, where you're from, and what brings you here in the chat. We're going to be getting started soon. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to be getting started in a couple of minutes. We're just going to wait for some more people to pop in, but please feel free to share your name, your pronouns, where you're from, and what brings you to the conversation. Okay, great. I'm just going to get us started. More people will pop in, but I'm really excited to be here with such an esteemed panelist and also to be collaborating with the American Muslim Bar Association on a wonderful event titled Transnational Feminisms and Collective Liberation on Black, Kashmiri, Muslim, and Palestinian Solidarities. My name is Jamie Swift, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the executive director of Black Radicals. So nice for everyone to be here. Like I said, please feel free to drop your name, your pronouns, where you're from, and what brings you here to the chat, so we can have a generative and exciting discussion. So, like I said, I'm Jamie, and I would love if our amazing co-hosts, Kulsum and Yarouj, to just feel free to introduce yourselves quickly, if you would like.
Hi, assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Kulsumi Jazz. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the advocacy chair here at the American Muslim Bar Association.
Hi, assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm Arouj. I am a member of the advocacy committee, a part of AMBA, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks so much. Also, I wanted to shout out Margarita Rosa, she, her from California by way of Brooklyn. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for being here. Thanks so much. So with the event, I just want to recap and kind of share a summary about the event. There's a long history of radical feminist organizing and struggles for collective liberation around the world. In interrogating these political memories, how are Black, Kashmiri, Muslim, and Palestinian feminists struggling for liberation in the respective environments they find themselves today? How can Black, Kashmiri, Muslim, and Palestinians learn and organize across difference to build radical racial solidarities? And how can these radical cross-racial solidarities not only catalyze our present organizing or radicalize our present organizing, but serve as a catalyst for shared collectivism in the future? So this is what this event is about. We have a brilliant panelist who I'm so excited to learn from. And I hope that the audience learns from the importance of radical cross-racial community and solidarities with one another. And just quickly, if you don't, I'm not familiar with Black Women Radicals. Black Women Radicals is a Black feminist advocacy organization, and we are dedicated to uplifting and centering Black women and gender expansive people's radical activism from around the world. And I also drop Black Women Radicals and AMBA's website and social media. So please give us both a follow and just kindly support our work. And Kulsum and Aruj, would you like to share more about AMBA?
Raji, would you like me to start? Okay. The American Muslim Bar Association is a representative body of Muslim lawyers, legal professionals, and aspiring legal workers committed to the practice of law and the pursuit of justice and equity. AMBA's work is inspired by the principles of the Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon them. These principles include love, justice, compassion, and mercy for all persons, with an emphasis on historically excluded and minoritized communities. Our legal activism is also inspired by the joy and beauty of the Ahlul Bayt, despite the pain and persecution they faced.
Thank you so much, Kulsum. Thank you for sharing your amazing work. Also, I want to shout out some people who dropped their names in the chat. Aaliyah Brown, she, her, joining from Northwest Washington, D.C., and looking forward to the discussion on solidarity and struggle for liberation. Hi, Grace, she, her pronouns, currently in Eugene, Oregon. And I'm here to learn more about how the things I've learned as a gender, sexuality, and intersectionality studies major manifest in real life social movements and what true solidarity and transnational coalition building looks like. Woo, Lord, we're about to get into this popping conversation, right? Thank you. Simone from Maryland, they, them. Thank you so much for being here. Sociologist of gender and sexuality. Great, perfect. This is so wonderful. And so we're going to get into introducing our amazing panelists, right? And so I guess, Kulsum, if you didn't mind starting us off introducing Vanessa Taylor.
Absolutely. Vanessa Taylor. Vanessa Taylor's pronouns are she and they. Vanessa Taylor is a Minnesota-born and Philadelphia-based writer focusing on Black Muslim womanhood and technology. She is specifically interested in surveillance, Afrofuturism, and the revolutionary potential of fiction. She is the curator of Nazar, an independent journalism project on surveillance, and the founding editor-in-chief of The Drinking Gourd, a Black Muslim literary magazine. And then we have Dr. Maha Hilal. Dr. Maha Hilal's pronouns are she, her, hers. Dr. Maha Hilal is an expert on institutionalized Islamophobia and has spent her career researching, writing, advocating, and organizing against it. Dr. Hilal holds a PhD in justice, law, and society from American University, where she wrote her dissertation on Muslim American responses to the War on Terror. She is co-director of Justice for Muslim Collective and an organizer with Witness Against Torture and a council member of the School of the Americas Watch. Dr. Hilal's writings have been published in Al Jazeera, Business Insider, The Daily Beast, Vox, and US News, among others.
Thank you so much. Yoruj, did you want to introduce our next panelist?
Yeah. Lubna Katami, pronouns she, her, hers, is an assistant professor at the Department of Asian American Studies at UCLA. She was the co-founder of Palestinian Youth Movement and the former executive director of the Arab Cultural and Community Center in San Francisco. She's currently a member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective She was a former postdoctoral fellow from the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley and received her PhD from the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Riverside. Lubna's research examines transnational Palestinian youth movements after the 1993 Oslo Accords through the 2011 Arab uprisings. Her work is based on scholar activist ethnographic research methods, and broadly, her scholarly interests include Palestine, critical refugee studies, the racialization of Arab and Muslim communities in the US, settler colonialism, youth movements, and transnationalism and indigenous and global South feminisms. So thank you so much, Lubna, for being here.
Oh, Yurush, did you, I think you froze. So I'm going to, she'll be back. I'm going to read Maria Mustak's bio and introduce you properly. Maria, she, her, hers is a feminist activist and independent researcher based in Kashmir. She is the co-founder and editor of the Kashmiri feminist collective, Zanan Wanan. She is a recipient of the 2021 Creative Activism Award by Cultures of Resistance Network for her digital project, Kashmir Pop Art, which makes use of contemporary surrealism through mixed media illustrations, digital collage, and photography. She is mainly interested in the decolonial and feminist intersection of art, academia, and activism. Maria is a graduate of the University of Delhi and completed her master's last year in gender, sexuality, and culture from Birkbeck University of London. Her research focuses on gender, militarization, precarity, and women's movements in Kashmir. So thank you all so much for being here. And before I pass it off to Kulsum, we're about to get started, but I just wanted to reiterate, and I should have said this is a safe space. We do not allow any transphobia, homophobia, queerphobia, ableism, fatphobia, Islamophobia. None of that is not allowed. And unfortunately, if you do, I will kick you out. This is just the rules of Black Women Radicals. And please respect our amazing co-hosts and our guests because they're about to bring you this fire. Okay, so Kulsum, I will pass it off to you.
Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone again. We're thrilled to host this discussion during this historic month, which holds the Stonewall Uprising, a movement spurred primarily by Black and POC trans and queer folks who fought for their rights and protested police brutality by the NYPD. We see and are inspired by similar resistance struggles here and in other occupied and settler colonialist nations by queer and trans Palestinian and Kashmiri folks whose oppression by the Israeli and Indian government is intensified by their multiple minoritized identities. For example, organizations like Al-Qaws for sexual and gender diversity in Palestinian society call out the hypocrisy and the insidious narrative of these regimes by teaching us that they usurp the history of radical movements to pinkwash their imperialist tactics. In other words, to paint themselves as saviors. With this history and these present day realities in mind, let's dive right in. Bismillah.
So I'll begin with the first question to our panelists. This is more about how you came to doing this kind of feminist praxis work. So the first question is, who or what inspired your radical feminist consciousness? Is there a moment or moments that you can recall that shaped your feminist praxis? In other words, what radicalized you? Vanessa, if you'd like to go first, or if anyone else.
Yeah, I can go. So I think for me, my radicalization is like very much an ongoing process. And I really appreciate coming to that realization. I think sometimes in organizing, there's a period where it was like you had to be the most radical in a sense, and this idea that you always had to be right and correct and that you weren't in this process of continuous growth. But like realizing that I am always learning, that I'm always thinking, rethinking about the things that I thought I knew has helped me just be a lot more comfortable and not nearly as nervous doing panels like this, for example. But I think for me, what made me first start thinking about like race, anti-Blackness, and white supremacy in the United States was the internet. I grew up in Hastings, Minnesota, which is kind of a small town. It's outside of the suburbs, but not quite country yet. So like country adjacent, basically. And so there, nobody was having those conversations with me. And I first found Black women talking about them on Tumblr. And so that was really big and that was really important for me. And I remember when I think I was 18, when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, I saw news about the protests and everything happening there on Tumblr to start. And so what kind of further radicalized me then was moving from Tumblr to deciding that I was going to go down to Ferguson for Ferguson October, which was a national call to action that organizers had put out to basically mobilize people to come down and support them on the ground. And when I was there, I was arrested outside of a Quick Trip with, was it 19 other people or something like that? And being in jail, again, certainly added to like my politics, my radicalization, even though it was a really short stint, it's like 24 hours, which is not much. But when I was in there, I remember the correctional officers came up to the people whose races they couldn't decide themselves, and just asked them, you know, what are you? And one of the people there who ended up being a good friend of mine, she's Somali and she's darker skinned, but she wears hijab. And so when they came up, she was like, oh, I'm Somali, I'm African. And the guy looked at her and was like, no. He's like, I don't think so. She was like, excuse me. He's like, I'm just gonna put down other. And then there was somebody who I was also in jail with who got their period. And when they asked for like a pads or tampons or something, the CEO was basically like, you're gonna have to bleed through your pants and that's all we can do for you. So yeah, that moment was a lot for me. And the people specifically who kind of shaped my feminist praxis, I think for me, it was not only the Black women I mentioned on Tumblr and social media platforms before, but also when I went home and began organizing, I worked really closely with Black youth. And in particular, I worked with a lot of Black Muslim youth. And so they were really important and relevant to me and like continuing to develop that praxis as a feminist and as an organizer overall.
It's an amazing journey. And I can imagine that would be a catalyst for, you know, your radical feminist praxis and so on. So thank you for sharing. Anyone else wants to go next?
Yeah, I can jump in. Well, first, thank you, Kulsum, Jamie, and Aruj for hosting us. AMBA and Black Women Radicals, really excited to be here. Vanessa, thank you. Your story really resonates, I think, with a lot of us. I have to say, you know, sort of my inauguration into a feminist trajectory or a Palestinian or Arab feminist trajectory was a very long time coming. It's still in formation, as Vanessa has talked about. I am the daughter and granddaughter of Palestinian refugees who were displaced from Palestine during the 1948 Nakba, when the Israeli state dropped a colony on Palestine and in turn dispossessed nearly 1 million Palestinian people who were never to make their right of return. My mom grew up in a refugee community in Jordan, and she would be considered of the age group that was called the generation of liberation, meaning that they were sort of in their formative years of political consciousness, like late teens, early 20s, when the launch of the Palestinian Revolution really started in the late 60s out of the camps, the refugee camps in Jordan. And so I think that like my entry into radical political activism, organizing, and even feminist radical organizing really began long before I was even born, because of the environment that my family was living in, because of what they had personally experienced. They ended up becoming secondary displaced refugees during the Black September massacre in Jordan in 1970. And so
once they had come to the United States, like there was a deep political and emotional relationship that that tethered them to the Palestinian struggle. And so I grew up in my early years with both my mom and my grandma being deeply involved in the Union of Palestinian Women in the United States. So always sort of being introduced to that kind of organizing from being a really young child, and that just being sort of a given, not really knowing anything else. That changed a little bit after the early 1990s peace process, which basically resulted in the decimation of a lot of Palestinian organizing in the far diaspora. But I think it was reignited for me on my own terms after 9/11, September 11th, 2001, because I was an Arab Palestinian youth growing up in the United States in a really anti-Arab, really anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian climate. And I have to say, this story is really important because during that time, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, so I didn't necessarily feel racialized alienation as a child. I mean, I did, but not in a way that was enough for me to be sorely aware of until after 9/11. And it was a really jarring contrast after that day where I all of a sudden really felt quite different than classmates, in my high school, for example. And I realized that a lot of the racism that they held about Arab communities, about Palestinians, it was at that moment especially connected, and the years that followed when I was starting university, really connected to the growth of the war on terror. And so I say this because that was an introduction to my own political activism, not like one that was inherited from my family or given to me by my family, but where I became, convicted that that war was not the answer, that US imperialist wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were tethered to racist state violence here in the United States, and Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism and anti-Black racism and indigenous, ethnic cleansing of indigenous peoples. But that gateway into politics was also really warped in a very visceral relationship with feminism. And what I mean by that is that as a young person, the feminism that was being beaten into us was that it was a very white colonial liberal feminism. And it was specifically like tethered to this idea that Laura Bush was going into Afghanistan to save Afghan women from the backward, barbaric, savage, Muslim, ominous terrorist men, right? And the same was applied to Palestine and Iraq. So I had a very reactionary relationship with feminism during the initial stages of my politicization, because I thought that that's all that feminism was and could be. And it took a while before I really started to understand my mom and my grandmother's involvement in the struggle as a feminist practice, before I could understand, before I was introduced and really engaged the feminist literatures of the Black radical feminist tradition that helped me completely understand that indigenous Black, third world, Arab, Palestinian feminisms were actually produced precisely as an otherwise means to the world of empire and imperialism and wars, and even those wars and racist state violence that masked itself under the guise of women's rights.
That was also a beautiful story. I mean, I can imagine all those things coming together, especially, colonization, settler colonialism. And yeah, I think it's a great point that you were a feminist even before you were even born, basically, because of the fact that your family, your grandparents were Palestinian refugees. So thanks for sharing that as well. Who wants to go next?
I can go next. First, I want to start by thanking Black women radicals and AMBA for organizing this event, and also to my fellow speakers who will now become part of my response. Because when you think about, and when I think about, what has radicalized me, it's being in spaces like this, where women typically tend to be on the front lines of fighting injustice. And even though this particular event was curated around feminism, right? Even if it wasn't, right, we would most likely have the same exact panelists because of, women, femmes, trans folks being in these justice spaces. So I want to acknowledge that. And I want to sort of share a more personal story. And so, when I think about feminism and maybe how I began to think about concretely what it meant and sort of the moment that I kind of felt it in my life, I think back to my life as a child. My dad actually passed away when I was 10. And so I grew up with my mom and my sister. And, for some more conservative Muslims, the fact that my mom was living in the United States by herself would have been unacceptable, right? A lot of women would have moved back to our home country, which is Egypt, because of the perception and belief, right, that you have to sort of be taken care of by a man. And so for me, just growing up with, my sister and my mom, I never really had this idea that I couldn't achieve what other people could achieve, right? Or that there were serious barriers to what I could do as a woman, as I identify. However, I think the interesting thing is that, my mom is a pretty conservative Muslim. And so when we were younger, I remember her speaking frequently about how liberatory Islam was and is to women. And, in the beginning, I think it was easier to digest that, right? And to think about, the context in which she was operating and the value system that this emerged out of. But for me, part of being a feminist and part of growing into this like belief system was about like contending on what does feminism mean from my own belief system, right? And like, what is my particular perspective? And I say that also recognizing, right, that when you say anything negative about Islam or acknowledge, patriarchy among Muslim communities, right, there's backlash. And so that's also part of being, a feminist. And you're, my experience is just being sort of constructed as a feminist or growing into this idea of feminism, often because of the constructions that are leveraged against me and others like me, right? So what does mainstream society say about Muslim women? What is the Muslim community? How do they treat Muslim women, right? And so it's like this constant navigation of, who's expecting what from you? What are the things you want to challenge and what are the things you don't want to challenge, right? How is it being weaponized in countries, as Lubna mentioned, like Afghanistan, right? Where saving Muslim women was one of the core features and reasons and rationales that the US government used to support the war. And also just this idea of different feminisms, right? I was reading today about women who are service members in the Army and the measures that the Army was taking to make the Army more equitable and like, how they were making accommodations to make the, context and environment feel more inclusive. So in the context in which I was reading it, that was framed as a form of feminism, right? And I'm sitting here thinking, well, this is not my concept of feminism, right? My concept of feminism is not accommodating to and participating in the military-industrial complex, right? So what does it actually mean? Is it just about gaining women's rights in the narrow frame that it's often referred to be able to enter into these spaces that have predominantly been male spaces, and in the context of the Army, right, that facilitate death and destruction for countries abroad? Or is it about, owning your identity, however you define it, right? Not being limited by that identity, working for peace and justice categorically, right? And just really, I think, helping others and helping yourself even unlearn as well as contend with what are the expectations that are put on you as a feminist, right? And, it just becomes more and more complicated the more I go through life and my career, because as a Muslim woman too, who's a very visible Muslim woman and, whose work is about Islamophobia, one of the hard things is that people don't see me as a credible voice on the topic, right? Simply because I am a woman. And it's often the case that, male voices are privileged above my voice, right? Regardless, again, of what the credentials are. And so there's so many things that, I think about when I think about being a feminist. And I think the last thing I'll say is, something that has been really important to my specific trajectory in terms of social justice work has been my work around closing Guantanamo and ending torture. And, most of you probably know that Guantanamo Bay is a prison that exists solely to house and detain Muslim men. There has never been another faith represented in Guantanamo in the post 9/11 world. So for me, my questions around feminism and my identity as a Muslim woman is about, like, what does it mean for me to be advocating for Muslim men, right? And we're thinking of Muslim men sort of as this larger category, right? Not in terms of how Muslim communities treat Muslim women, right? But this, sometimes this feeling that, would it be reciprocated, right? If there was a prison that was housed, that was, created specifically to detain Muslim women, right? What would be the response? And so Muslim women are not only on the front lines of fighting this injustice, right? And sort of contending with what are the dynamics in all of that, as well as then, dealing with a lot of the fallout and the backlash that happens as a result of, in a lot of ways, what has been directed at Muslim men or Muslim individuals, right, who are perceived as being male.
Thanks, Maha. That was amazing. And I definitely shout you out for being one of the only women and feminists doing this kind of work. I feel like your voice for sure should be the only one that's listened to above the, so-called experts who are often white males, but thank you so much. So I think Maria, you're next. And Maria's in Kashmir right now, and it's the middle of the night or the morning. I think it's 4:30 in the morning. So we want to just thank her so much for being up at this time. Go ahead, Maria.
Thank you, Ruj. And I want to quickly thank the organizers for organizing this really important discussion. I'm really glad that this dialogue is happening and really excited to be a part of this. And thank you to the speakers as well for sharing their stories. I mean, it resonates with me so deeply. But to start my response and to make it a bit more personal, I studied in Indian University for my undergrad, and before that, I'd actually never really stepped out of Kashmir. So being in Kashmir, and but before I sort of start this discussion, I want to contextualize this for the listeners. Kashmir is this region which is under the military control of in the Indian state. Ever since the Indian state came into the post-colonial Indian state came into existence. And it's the most densely militarized zone in the world. Needless to say, the people are just brutalized and occupied, and there's like a lot of repression. But growing up in Kashmir, I didn't really know any other way of life. And I just because we grew up as a generation that was born in the 1990s, and then the 90s in Kashmir was a period of brutal, militarized violence as India responded to the armed resistance in Kashmir. And then, after that decade, we grew up sort of being alienated from our own histories. Within our schools, we're never really, not just where the Kashmiri students, we never really read about our own histories, but not just about the histories, but also the present, like what's going on around us. There is no conversation about our lived realities, right? So I grew up, being so alienated with my immediate surroundings. I never really thought about Kashmir as I never really reflected upon my Kashmiri identity, right? And it's only when I was 18 years old or something, and I stepped out of Kashmir for my undergrad, and I went to India to study. And then I had like a certain, like a parallel in front of me, like a different way of life that people were living of sorts. Um, and I remember, obviously, like in the first semester of my college, thinking about all these sorts of critical discussions that were taking place in my college and stuff like that. And I was exposed to these spaces. And I was also how it is, I began this inquiry within my own self, asking questions about my own identities and my experiences and so on. And I remember visiting Kashmir after my first semester, and it's so fascinating to me. It's like I saw the military for the first time. Even though they've always been like occupying the roads, for instance, patrolling the roads, but I have never really seen them, with that kind of anger or like that kind of question as to why are you there. It's so unnatural for the military to be at these checkpoints to stop the population and ask them for their identity cards and stuff like that. So I guess, for me, my feminist consciousness really started from this, like this resistance to this institutional exclusion of Kashmiris from not only like at a discourse level, but like witnessing up close, whilst being in India, witnessing how Kashmir is like this, like it's at the same time it's hyper visible in the Indian discourse, but at the I mean, on the same level, like it's not, people don't really talk about it. They don't care about what's going on. And then I mean, for me, I started like my feminist inquiry with this like really deep-rooted, like these intersectional principles, even before I, didn't even understand what intersectionality really meant, right? So like Maha was talking about how Muslim identity is so entangled into like the questions that she started asking herself. It was the similar case to me. I don't think I started my my questions from a strict gendered lens. Like to me, they started first and foremost from that Kashmiri identity, from that marginalized identity, right? And of course, down the line when I started my sort of whatever work and this engagement with other people in this movement, I was then able to sort of navigate those different identities and see how different forms of oppressions are sort of working together to not only amplify each other, but to sustain each other in the very first place, right? So that was that, but I was also then a part of these feminist sort of collectives, movements within India. And I noticed that there was again like this, number one, there was this, this brutal state crackdown on any discussions, any form of potential mobilization about Kashmir. So even if it is these informal college spaces where, you're having discussions, universities are supposed to be these safe spaces where you can like literally talk about anything. But we weren't even allowed to hold any discussions about Kashmir, particularly after the current Modi-led government came into power, which was like literally the same year I went to the college. And I witnessed this firsthand how the university spaces, like in a time, like in a material form, changed almost, to accommodate to that regime's idea of nationalism, hyper-nationalism, and how questions about marginal identities are supposed to be taken up even within academic spaces. So I guess, like Vanessa mentioned earlier on as well, for me, like my feminist reflection is an ongoing process. I think it's something that resonates with a lot of us. It's this continuous process of reflection, like literally every day, from thinking about, from thinking about how I want to translate that anger I have into my academic inquiries, for instance, but also in my interpersonal relations with my my family or my neighbors, and then my my other surroundings. So I guess all in all, really, like for me, feminism is at this point like a way of seeing things, and a way of a lens almost to everything that I do, even if it isn't directly related to my like my my activism regarding women's rights and so on and so forth.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you everyone for sharing. It's so, I'm going to put it in the gallery mode. It's so important that we have all these different perspectives. And so I'm about to lead into the next question because everyone wants to talk about solidarity nowadays. It's almost like I don't know, the commercialization of the term solidarity reminds me like of also intersectionality, when people don't even know what that's about. I don't know, it just seems like this buzzword. So in my question for everyone is like, what does transnational solidarity even mean? Because, and like, what are your perspectives on it? Because I feel like so many people think it's so many different things, and it can be so many different things, right? But like, it's not just a one and done. It takes a lot of work. So whoever's interested in going first, but really want to know what transnational solidarity means to you all. And don't be scared, okay? You know, just jump in.
I could maybe give it a go. Yeah, it's been so great to hear everyone's sort of their feminist consciousness journeys, and just a lot of love and appreciation to all of you. What is transnational solidarity? What is feminist solidarity? I mean, I really think that there are two ways that I think of solidarity or joint struggle. The first, and I think that this is something that's become so much more clear as crisis is mounting literally in every corner of the world, affecting everyone, especially within the last decade. But the first is that the systems of oppression, the actors of oppression, the states of oppression, the corporations that are producing oppression, whether it's land annexation or extrajudicial police killings or military warfare or climate degradation or expanding of borders that's displacing people, right? They are usually a very, very small number of actors that have very deep, intimate bonds with one another. And that is, you know, it's not even just like a symbolic thing, like our oppression here in Turtle Island is similar to the oppression in Palestine. It's that there's a very deep, intimate collaboration between US state, anti-Black state violence and Israeli colonial state violence against Palestinians, an exchange of crowd control, surveillance techniques, an exchange of military combat strategies, an exchange of police trainings, an exchange of technologies, right? Like it's very evident. Same with Kashmir, right? We have 1 million boots on the ground occupying 8 million people in Kashmir, but India is one of the largest purchaser of Israeli weapons, right? So it's literally on the streets, affecting people across the world are the same manufactured bullets and tear gas canisters and stun grenades that are being produced by a very small number of systems and actors, whether it's state, public, or private, that are oppressing us. So on the one hand, solidarity to me is us literally joining forces to tear down those systems, to end those collaborations, to call for accountability from those corporations, to suspend the manufacturing of nuclear weapons development, of these types of technologies that are only meant to destroy life and in no way meant to uplift life. But then there's this other form of solidarity that I think is profoundly feminist in a way that a lot of people don't always think of, which is that I really do think that, you know, the story that I shared earlier, I think that a lot of us come into our own skin and our own flesh and our own understanding of ourselves and families and our communities, oftentimes through the experiences and struggles and literatures and theories of other people. So for me, I'm a Palestinian Arab, but I'm living in the United States, prohibited from actually being able to return to Palestine by, you know, colonially erected borders that prohibit me from going back, right? So for me, as someone who lives here, my coming to consciousness, my understanding of community power, my understanding of the longevity of protracted resilience and resistance and steadfastness was quite frankly first introduced to me by Black feminist thinkers before it was introduced to me by Palestinian feminist thinkers. It was introduced to me by the struggles of Indigenous peoples whose land I live on, the stolen land of Indigenous peoples I live on, right? And so I think that this form of solidarity is really important because when we invite one another into our homes, into our communities and share our literatures, our creation stories, our survival and resilience techniques, then what we are doing is uplifting one another to take it back to our own community and to share those techniques so we don't have to continue reproducing life-creating worlds from scratch in these fragmented geographies. And that is a form of solidarity that I do think is profoundly feminist and profoundly undervalued oftentimes when we think of solidarity.
Wow. That was a word. That was a message. Let me put it back to the gallery view. Thank you so much for sharing that, Lubna, because I do think there's different forms of solidarity. You talked about like this long-term struggle and solidarity, and also like the, you know, present and like shorter terms and short-term goals for solidarity too. So I really, really appreciate that. And yeah, I can say so many things. I felt like I just got a good word there. But does anyone else want to share, what does transnational feminist solidarity mean to them?
I can go next.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lubna. I think it was so insightful to listen to what you're saying, and I really agree with you. I think you know, when I think about like transnational solidarity as a Kashmiri first and foremost, you know, I think about first the idea of like, you know, modern nation states in the very first place, and the immediate history of violence that a lot of like, you know, the contemporary sovereign nation states that we see today have, you know, and I guess like one way of thinking about it, like, you know, Lubna, you mentioned, is to you know, first and foremost think about like the systemic ways in which these structures of inequalities are reproduced. And first, like, I guess like at the core of this discussion is a reflection about American imperialism, or, you know, the like the British colonialism, and, you know, and how that has now been translated into like these new structures of globalization, or like other forms of cultural imperialism that continue to explicitly or implicitly benefit these states or the empires, even if the empire doesn't quote unquote exist formally, you know. And then we look at like, you know, we look at the historical realities of these people, like, you know, when we're thinking about Palestine or we're thinking about Kashmir, and we then correlate these questions with like the immediate history of like colonialism, you know. I mean, it's fascinating to me how and, you know, when we grow up, we read about at least in Kashmir, we read about colonialism as this thing of the past, you know, that used to happen, and then people used to colonize, like, you know, these Britishers or these Europeans used to colonize these lands, and then they went away, as if it was this neutral process of it just happened for some time, and then it ended, and then things went back to as they were. But I guess it comes with so much struggle of going through this painful ordeal in your, you know, at least for me in your university, of like reflecting and like finding, it's trying so hard to find out how is it that that colonialism has never really ended. It is just, you know, those structures are like, you know, it's like they've changed their outer form, the way they present themselves, but they very much continue to benefit the same set of people they did literally like 150 years ago, you know, in different ways. And then we also, then for me, I also think about feminist politics in similar contexts around the world, you know, like this, a kind of politics that is rooted in these principles of like, you know, material realities of people at the end of the day. You know, this is not just a conversation about discourses or about ideas, it's about people's lives. You know, it's fascinating. Like we live in a world, and we like to, when we, a lot of these conversations, you know, when they're happening, they often, at least in pop culture, they often start with, oh, we are living in 21st century, how can we accept this? But you think about, when you look at like, we're not living in this like timeline where, in fact, that is also like a really colonial way of looking at you know, what constitutes as civilized societies or just behavior, right? And then you know, we also try to think about like the sort of ways in which people are actively disenfranchised from not only voicing their opinions but literally living a free life. We still live in a we are I think like this is we are at a place in this history where people now have to make a case for a dignified life. It's come to that, literally. And then how that basic idea gets convoluted in these like large discussions about, okay, let's have a dialogue about whether people should be allowed to live or not, right? I guess, like, I keep saying this over and over again when we think about all of these critical issues around the world, whether that is literally from like climate crisis to like the more immediate like war and persecution of certain groups and communities. At the core of all of these things, of course, they sound really complex and there's like so much history and politics, but at the core of it, it is so simple. While there is this certain groups or in like there it's like, in a way it's also about this class struggle of the rich benefiting from like this historical marginalization of the poor or the workers or whatever you want to look at it through that lens. And then like a very simple idea that stop being greedy and stop killing other people. I think that by and large, like everybody sort of accepts that moral principle of we cannot really like kill other people. But then how we getting lost in that convoluted language where everything comes down to I guess I'm sort of off track, going off the track from like the discussion here. But yeah, I mean, I try to think, like, for me, transnational alliances are so important because, we as a Kashmiri, I live with this enforced national identity of sort of being an Indian, right? Like, we do not have a state of our own. We are under the military occupation of Indian state, and like similarly, like for a lot of occupied people around the world, we do not, by the virtue of being occupied by another state, we automatically are excluded, institutionally excluded from lots of processes of, even if we're talking about like that formal, mechanisms of dialogue and peace building, quote unquote. So one radical way to challenge that is to, collaborate with individuals, groups, collectives around the world who first and foremost reject this institutional framework of, working together. There's only a certain way, there's only a certain legitimate way in which you can collaborate or you can work together or you can research together, right? And I think, like, for me, feminist politics like offers you that lens because it starts from the very rejection of the existing structures, because those existing structures are built upon oppression of people. So yeah, I mean, and then this thing, to wrap it up, it's this continuous process of learning from other feminist groups as to how they are resisting within their own contexts.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Let me remove the pen so we can all see each other. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm actually interested also with Vanessa, what your thoughts on transnational feminist solidarity, especially in the context of, I'm just going to be really quick and frank. I do a project on Black and Asian feminist solidarities, and someone said to me, well, why are you working with Asian feminists? They're not in solidarity with us, right? And so not knowing these like long histories between one another, right? But also critically discussing anti-Blackness and all sorts of things, right? So I'm interested in like what your thoughts are too about what transnational feminist solidarity means, especially when sometimes we don't know the long histories that we have with one another, and the media, the white supremacist media, always wants to show the negative aspects of our relationships.
Yeah. So I mean, fundamentally for me, if I just think about transnational feminist solidarity in like a sentence, for me, it's understanding that freedom is a global struggle. And so as Linda was talking about, anything that happens to you happens to me. There is this intimate connection and collaboration that is taking place at a global scale to build oppression, to have oppressed communities, to have people in power. And so also then with this, there's this understanding that you don't only care about me because of self-interest, right? Like, you don't only care about me to the extent that I can serve you or I can make your position better, because that often results in I think the disconnect that many people are feeling sometimes, where it's like, oh, well, we'll use Black people long enough to be mules, and then when they're kind of done, when we don't need that anymore, it's just F you, goodbye. So that's the exact opposite of what I mean. What I mean is just this understanding of how everything that happens is connected in this world. There's not a single thing that exists in a vacuum. There's not a single articulation of oppression that is not preceded by another. There's nothing that we cannot tie together if we really wanted to sit here and do it. Sometimes when I talk, I feel like, this is very niche, but there's this meme of Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where he's like pointing at a board and screaming. Well, I could Google it, but I feel like that's me most of the time when I'm talking. But I think like a way to really illustrate this point about like these intimate connections and these collaborations is for me to like briefly talk about surveillance, which is one of my like focuses. And one program that I talk about a lot specifically is called Countering Violent Extremism. And so there's a lot of ways to talk about CVE. CVE refers to both a broader framework at a national and global scale, but it also refers to multiple iterations of DHS programming. So the one I'll just kind of focus on is the Obama era CVE. And this was a grant program that rolled out in 2014. Well, the grants rolled out in 2016 and piloted in 2014. And again, without getting into all the details about surveillance on a global stage and how you can just connect America's Islamophobia back to anti-Black Islamophobia specifically, which was fostered during the transatlantic slave trade, which was often pushed by Spain. So you see it more commonly throughout areas where Spain had a stronghold, which is South America. We can just focus on CVE programming alone, and we could look at how CVE in the United States is not just the United States' invention, but in fact draws very heavily from the United Kingdom's PREVENT. And PREVENT is a program that, like CVE, is about countering, or in this case, preventing extremism. And like CVE, it claims to do so by identifying risk factors, particularly in youth, like CVE, and staging interventions with those youth. And so again, it's just one small example to kind of talk about how one program that you might think is kind of the United States' own invention, a manifestation of the United States' own Islamophobia, something that is unique to it, right, is in fact not all that unique at all. It's very common. And then of course, when we're talking about transnational feminist solidarity, Blackness is fundamental for me. And so I think remembering too that Black people are everywhere. So for me to even say that I care about Black people, that I am concerned with Black liberation, for that to be true, I have to be concerned with global politics. I have to have a transnational perspective, right? I can't say I care about Black people if my focus is limited to the United States. And this particularly became clear for me when I was organizing in Minneapolis, because the majority of people that I organized with were East African refugees, often Somali. And so we would talk often about things that were going on within Somalia or other countries within Africa, talk about how it impacted the communities who were there, talks about how it impacted people in the United States, the factors of immigration or being refugees, and et cetera. And so I think too, Afrofuturism then has been particularly useful for me recently in exploring transnationalism and kind of that work in general. Because seeing how people dream and what they're dreaming of and like what forms they're using to articulate those dreams. Is it rap? Is it another form of music? Are we talking about written word and literature like novels? Are we talking about oral stories? How are we talking? How are you dreaming? And seeing the dreams that kind of take you into account without you having to ask is really important too. And I think when you broaden it to other futurisms outside of Afrofuturism and Black people specifically, it can also help get rid of some of that. I don't know if distrust is the word I want, but it's what I'm going with right now because I've had a very long day. But it can kind of get rid of some of that distrust and that lingering unease. Because coming back to what I said, when you take me into account without me even having to ask, that means a lot. That means something, right? When you care about me and mine and my communities and the people that I love, we are all on your mind just because we're there and not because you had to feel guilted into it. That for me is like the basis of solidarity.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to give, you said it's a lot, all the responses have been so excellent. And yeah, I think someone said in the chat, like, this is what I was waiting for, this discussion, right? And so Dr. Halal, I would love to give you the floor to discuss, like, what does transnational feminist solidarity mean to you?
I love all the responses so far from my fellow speakers. And I really appreciate Vanessa saying that feminism is freedom, as freedom is a global struggle. And, you know, that kind of speaks to the work that I've done, specifically because I focus on the war on terror, right? We know the war on terror is not just a war that happens abroad, nor is it a war that just happens domestically, right? And so when we make these connections, I think it enables us to really fight back against state violence, right? Which we're seeing now in Colombia, which we're seeing now in Israel, right? Like, so how are we actually leveraging those connections to fight back against the same problem, which continues to be state violence? And one of the things I think about in particular is the fact that, you know, those of us who live in the United States, whether we like it or not, right, we're part of this country, right? And to whatever extent we are playing a role in US empire, right? We pay taxes, right, to the US government, which a lot of it goes towards militarism and warfare abroad, which has obviously disastrous consequences for everyone in the world, including domestically, right, where the military and militarism is used against our communities, including, right, Black communities in the US. So I think that it's really, really, really important to think about our role living in the empire, and in the empire that specifically has caused so much damage, right? I don't think there are many countries that we can think about where there's a conflict and a war where the US is not somehow involved, whether it's directly or indirectly. And so to me, it's really important and imperative to make those connections. The second thing that I really think about is, you know, the way that gender has been used in the war on terror. So as Lubna addressed previously, right, when we talk about Afghanistan, right, gender and liberating Muslim women was a big part and was a very explicit rationale for why we needed to go to Afghanistan and wage war on that country. It poses sort of a conundrum, right? Because for those of us in the United States, it begs the question, right? There's a sort of rhetorical questions. Are you going to stand with the terrorists in Afghanistan, or are you going to be part of US empire? And if you're going to be part of US empire, right, you have to be part of the narrative and part of the discourse that says that Muslim women are oppressed and they do in fact need to be saved. And who they need to be saved by, they need to be saved from Muslim men, right? And so there's this way that the US empire and the US government, right, is trying to pit Muslim women in particular against each other and making you decide, you know, which narrative do you want to fit into? Which story do you want to be a part of, right? And I think that that's obviously a really big problem, right? And there's all these conversations, even domestically, like that we're forced to contend with. Is hijab liberatory or not, right? And it's never questions, I mean, it's not never, but it's often questions that are coming from the external world, right? We're never allowed to address these questions on our own time, right? In our own frames, in our own ways, right? It's always these questions that we have to answer as a matter of urgency, right? Because if, you know, we don't decide whether or not the burqa is, you know, oppressive in Afghanistan, well then, you know, like how are we going to go to war and support militarism? So I think that it's just, you know, really important. And one of the ways that I've approached solidarity specifically is to, you know, work on specific issues where there are direct and concrete connections. So for example, last year, I organized an event called Torture is an American Value, right? We all know that. It's not an abomination, right? It is part of American history. And so the people we had on the panel was a former Guantanamo Bay survivor, an individual who survived Chicago police torture, and a survivor from Chile, right, who we know gets significant support from the government of the United States. And so all of them were able to talk about, right, the commonalities in their experiences, right? And the main thread being the United States' desire to control, to surveil, and dominate communities of color, right? And so I think that that to me was a very concrete way we could connect different struggles, right, along a very specific issue. And, I think that's important because oftentimes the hard thing with solidarity, right, is especially when the state continues to throw so much oppression at all of our different communities, right, it becomes overwhelming to even deal with what you're given, right? Like, how do you deal with Islamophobia, right? How do you deal with anti-Blackness, which is part of Islamophobia? How do you deal with xenophobia, right? How do you deal with all of these systems? And so it is a really overwhelming task, right? And so I think the ways we've approached it are often in ways that throw other communities under the bus, right? So again, it's really coming together on a particular issue, right? And figuring out like, what are, again, the common themes and how do we build on that? And I think that, people practice solidarity in a lot of different ways. And I'm not suggesting that I'm proposing anything new, but I think in this particular example that I shared, I think it was very poignant because also when the panelists heard each other, they even talked about, for example, the Chicago police torture survivor talked about, oh, this is why we need to abolish, for example, the military, right? And what the military is doing and what the military is partaking in when it comes to Guantanamo and warfare abroad. And so I think that those are some of the themes that I want to emphasize. And just to say that, the interesting thing that that's weird about state violence is that oftentimes the more the state represses you, the more solidarity emerges, right? And so it often sort of is a backlash to the state. And I think what we have seen, particularly in the war on terror, right? Of course, there are divisions among Muslims, right? Those who decide to work with the government or quote unquote sell out, right? But there are also those that come together because we're sort of frustrated and tired of dealing with these oppressive policies and laws, as well as these oppressive narratives that continue to shape the ways that people view us. So I really, I'm really, excited to be having this conversation because I think it is a moment that we are talking a lot about solidarity. And, I think tomorrow I'm organizing an event with a colleague of mine from School of the Americas Watch about US empire in the case of Colombia and Palestine, right? And so again, like, how do we forge these very concrete connections? And then how do we move from that? And I think, again, with like the war on terror context in particular around Muslim women, it's sort of collectively coming together and rejecting these narratives that are imposed on us, right? We don't owe it to anyone to answer questions about whether hijab is liberatory or not, right? Whether we are oppressed by Muslim men or not. And we are already having these conversations internally, right? And so I think there is a lot of work to be done, but considering how often and how frequent Muslim women in particular on the front lines of fighting injustice, I think that this transnational solidarity is extremely important.
Thank you so much. All the responses were so rich, and I feel like we need a part 2 to this because like time has already escaped us and I'm like, oh my Lord, and I'm over here taking notes. So it's just been a lot, but it's so great in terms of like the richness of this conversation. And I feel like all of y'all are so brilliant, but we're going to move to the next part of the conversation, which is like the last part. And hopefully we have some time for Q&A. And I also want to honor Maria's time because it's early, but Kulsum, if you didn't mind taking the last part of the conversation and maybe we can have time for like 1 or 2 questions from the audience.
Absolutely. Thank you all for all of your very insightful, powerful, eloquent, incisive answers to that last question, especially tying together the fact that the powers that be, these structures of oppression are all working together. And what does that mean for us when we're building our transnational solidarity? I really liked what Vanessa had pointed out, that our liberation is bound up together. And I liked the way they were imagining what our future would look like, that, what would it look like if we just thought about one another, not because we needed something from the other person, not because it was transactional or that we needed to barter with another group of people in order to, gain our own rights. What would it mean to just think about somebody just because? And so with that, I'd like to ask the question of, what are your hopes for the future of cross-racial feminist movement building? What concrete actions can we take to build cross-racial solidarity in furtherance of our collective liberation? Are there any specific action steps you can recommend to build solidarity sustainably? Are there any books, readings, podcasts, videos to stream that you'd like to put in a plug for to our audience members?
And don't be scared. You could just hop in, but I also want to say that we want to honor your time. So if your responses could be, I don't want to rush, but like probably 1 to 2 minutes. But we would love to hear your hopes for the future of, what are your hopes for the future of cross-racial solidarity?
I guess I could start again. Okay, so I think that we are living in a very interesting moment, and I think many of us kind of gestured to this. I kind of gestured to it earlier. Crisis is mounting everywhere in all of our communities, and we're talking about a moment with the highest rates of feminicide in the world. We're talking about a moment with the highest rates of displacement in the world. We're talking about a moment with such extreme, ruthless state colonial violence through wars and racist policing and militarization everywhere, land degradation, climate degradation, and so much more. This moment is coalescing to produce catastrophe of like unparalleled proportions, but that also provides us an opening. And I think that one thing that all of our communities and movements are struggling with is that our quarrel with the post-colonial, post-racial, neoliberal context is something that we have not yet fully resolved in our movement spaces. What I mean by this is that it is not just the traditional overt colonial enterprises or white supremacist right-wing forces that is restricting our ability to move forward with radical visions of decolonization. In fact, the greatest danger and the greatest gatekeepers to the existing status quo are liberals who are really invested in stabilizing the existing infrastructure of the world that we're in, that has produced catastrophe of these proportions, right? So what I say when I think about my hopes for cross-racial solidarity, I mean, Adrienne Marie Brown puts it beautifully when she talks about we're living in a moment that it's an imagination battle, right? And I think that means that there's a lot of work that we need to do together to imagine an otherwise world, an otherwise system, to enact it, to build it, to enact it. And that doesn't mean a complete disposal of all of our movement techniques and strategies of the past, but it maybe means that we need to do an honest appraisal of them, borrowing what was generative from them and creating all the new things that we haven't quite gotten to create in our past moving forward. And I think that doing that together, while also in our communities, is what I hope for in terms of the future of cross-racial solidarity. I know I'm at my 2 minutes. I just want to say that right now is a profoundly important time for Palestinians. Our intifada, the uprisings currently unfolding in Palestine, really is marking a new milestone in our struggle. And we're really committed to sustaining this moment of resisting Israeli settler colonialism, occupation, dispossession, understanding that's not just about what happened in the month of May, but that it's about 73 years of our occupation and dispossession. There's a lot of ways to be involved in the Palestinian struggle, and I'm going to drop some links for the Palestinian Feminist Collectives pledge that Palestine is a feminist issue, and a toolkit on how to engage the Palestinian liberation struggle in the current moment.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Lubna. You talking about really like taking an introspective approach and looking at our past to see what lessons we can gain for the future really reminded me of this symbol called Sankofa. It's this bird that's basically looking back. For those of you that don't know, it's from the Akan people from Ghana, and it's basically symbolizes the importance of reaching back into the past to gain that knowledge and to bring it into the present in order to make positive progress. So thank you for that, Lubna. Does anyone else want to go next on sharing what your radical imaginings for the future look like?
I can go next. I want to just quick share a brief anecdote, and it's a very sad one. So 4 years ago in the greater DMV area, many of you probably had heard of Nabra Hassanin, who was a Nubian Egyptian who was killed and murdered, unfortunately. And the person who murdered her was an undocumented immigrant. And the government continued to claim that, this person was part of the MS-13 gang from El Salvador and was really trying to not only stoke the fears of the larger public, but also the Muslim community as well. And to get those in the Muslim community who could be receptive to this narrative, right, of being against sort of, quote, illegal immigration, right, to galvanize support from the Muslim community directed at non-Muslim Latinx folks who were undocumented. And so I mentioned that anecdote and that, very sad story, because I think that that's one of the ways we often get tripped up in this journey, right, to foster cross-racial solidarity, is because we are so easily, unfortunately, divided by a lot of the narratives and policies, right, that are stem from the government, right? And the point of the government's, rhetoric and policies, obviously, to divide and conquer. And how easy is it to do that? Because they're doing that on the one hand, but also criminalizing each community on their own on the other hand. So I think that that's really important, is to sort of resist that piece of it, right? To resist this effort that we know is coming from the government and the narratives, right? To pit us against each other, right? And then the second thing is, what I think is really important and what I've been invested in for a long time is the idea of internalized oppression. And there is a lot of it in the Muslim community, and I'm sure in other communities as well. So when we have internalized oppression, right, I think it becomes more easy to express oppression towards others, right? Because that means you're absorbing the problematic narratives without question or critique that the government, society, et cetera, is leveraging against your community. And, a lot of these narratives and policies and laws, it doesn't just affect one community, right? It affects multiple communities. So I think unlearning this internalized oppression, being able to dissect the narratives and the policies, understanding, the ways in which multiple communities are being targeted at the same time by the same things, and really challenging them. And I know a lot of Muslims tend to get caught up on this idea that, Islam is fundamentally an anti-racist religion. While that might be the case in theory, right, Muslims are not anti-racist individuals inherently. So but my observation and perception of the Muslim community as well is that we really need to push back on anti-Blackness and other systems of oppression that are operating internally, which further divides us, right, on an internal level, but also on an external level, and therefore our ability to fight back against Islamophobia, anti-Blackness, xenophobia, et cetera.
Thank you for sharing, Maha. Yeah, I think what you said about, it's the oldest game in the playbook to do this divide and conquer bullshit. I'm sorry for my language, but that's the oldest game in the playbook. And, if we are to imagine a better future together, then that's something that we should very intimately understand and fight back against and say that we're not playing by that book. So, is there, I know we're still waiting to hear from a few folks. I don't know who wants to go next, but
I can go next.
Okay.
Thank you, Wilson. Thank you. I really agree with Lubna and Maha on everything that they said. And I'm not going to repeat that because a lot of points that I wanted to make, they already did that. But I guess for me, I really don't have any immediate next things to do in that sense, because it stems from this understanding that fortunately or fortunately, I'm not sure, this is a long battle, right? This is not a a short term, like I would like to hope it was a short term project, but I guess like one of the ways I want to think about this kind of work or this kind of like movement building or solidarities is by first and foremost like rejecting this ideological propaganda that because at the end of the day a lot of what we're talking about is also a sort of a war of ideologies, right? And we at all costs we need to reject and resist against these supremacists or these fascist or authoritarian ideologies that really like other people that create like so much widespread hatred for communities, for groups, for cultures or whatever it is. So I suppose, for how I think about it, like it comes back to this feminist principle of like the personal is political, right? Practicing this like radical empathy based on principles of justice. That doesn't mean that, I'm also empathetic towards like abusers or, like oppressors in that particular context. But, like whatever feminist praxis we're sort of indulging in, it's rooted in these principles of like equity and like justice. And I suppose that is one. The second way is also to sort of continuously analyze not just like how the resistance solidarities are building, but also like how these fascist and authoritarian states and institutions are also like strengthening their solidarities in order to oppress us even further, right? Or to evolve in the ways that they respond to our resistance, people's resistance across the world. Like Lubna was mentioning early on about like this global arms trade, for instance, right? The military-industrial complex. It is like at the core, like I mean, American capitalism ultimately is the core of all of these discussions, and that it's not that difficult for us to really understand. So I guess a lot of like this cross movement, cross transnational work, for me really is like a deep commitment towards this long-term vision of in loose terms we like to say a better world, but really like a world without any oppression. It's very much possible, like you said, like you mentioned, like a radical, like even in imagining a world such as that is like resistance in the very first place, where all the structures, all the entire culture is in a way sort of designed to bar you from doing so.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Mary. That was very powerful. Thank you. And I think,
yeah, I'll keep mine pretty short. I think for me, just kind of touching on specific action steps, and then readings. I mostly read, so it's all readings that make me think of building a cross-racial feminist movement. But for one, I think you always have to like kind of go back to your community or whatever communities you claim and kind of do that internal work, which can be frustrating sometimes. I'm not a very extroverted person, so I know it can be very draining for me to go back into my community and try to have conversations where we're tackling, all the different isms that people buy into. Where we're tackling xenophobia, where if I'm talking to non-Muslim Black people, where I'm trying to deal with Islamophobia. But at the same time, as long as I like claim these people, as long as they are the people that I'm concerned with, then it is my job and it is my business to ensure that I'm doing the work with regards to political education. And then as for like books and readings, I think for me, just Black studies in general and like Black feminism or womanism has been really influential. And most recently, I've read In the Wake by Christine Sharp, which has like very fundamentally formed the way that I think about things and the way that I kind of see how oppression and how all of that plays out in my head. Like in my head, it's very much like somebody threw a stone in the water and you're just seeing all of those ripples kind of spreading out through the water surface. And so at that point, then it's not even just talking about like the connections between our oppression. It is really looking at us as all being within that one body of water. And there's no connection because there's no distinction really. But yeah, so those, and then always, of course, too, I look at science fiction a lot. I look at Afrofuturism. I look at the work of Octavia Butler, specifically actually her work outside of the Parable series. The Parable series is dope, don't get me wrong. But the other ones get a little more weird and a little more into things. But yeah, I think sci-fi and fiction too has a really important, really relevant place in any movement building conversation.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your, suggestions, your responses. I think this is was such a rich, like I said, and generative conversation, which ended pretty quickly. I mean, like, what does it mean? Like when you are having a good time, like things seem to like cut short. But I feel like I learned, and I know the audience learned so much from each and every one of you. I just appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us and also speak to the audience, because I think we need each other. I think we all talked about this, or y'all all talked about this. We need each other more than ever right now. And we have to, like Kulsum was saying, go back and fetch what is at risk of being left behind so that we can build the future and the radical imaginations everyone talked about, and this radical transformative world that we want to see. And I think it starts off us having discussions, right? And like being in community with one another. Not to say that we're all gonna be, see each other all the time or whatnot, but I feel like Zoom has been a great place for us to connect and really get to know one another. We are 4 minutes away from 8 o'clock. And I want to just honor your time, Marie. It's so early and I feel so bad. And I'm not sure if we're able to, or if the panelists feel comfortable taking questions, but I want y'all to, say yay or nay, but if people have questions, you can email Black Men Radicals and we can just like send your questions if our panelists feel comfortable, so you can answer them directly, because we really want to honor y'all's time. And folks are tired, y'all. We tired. I mean, we just tired, okay? So how does everyone feel about that? I don't want to put you on the spot, but is that okay? Okay, I respect y'all too much for all that.
To the person who had posed a question, a very thorough, thoughtful question in the Q&A box, I think we can email that as well to all 4 of our speakers. I think part of the question was kind of answered, and also in a few people's answers about anti-Blackness and anti like xenophobia and queerphobia. That part of the question I recall people answering. So the rest, especially, I think can be answered via email. So sorry, apologies to that person, and thank you for putting such a thoughtful question forward.
Definitely. And from just everyone, we just want to say thank you so much again. And if anyone has anything else to plug, please plug really quickly. I know there's like some events going on, but if you would like to drop your PayPal information, whatever you would like to do, we have a couple of minutes, so feel free to quickly plug whatever you're doing. Does anyone have anything to plug? I know we dropped links in the chat for people to follow everyone, but does anyone want to plug anything really quickly before we wrap up?
Awesome. I think folks are plugging things in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
I also want to take my time.
Ooh.
Sorry, I just wanted to take a second to say thank you to everybody. I learned a great deal, and it was just so soul nourishing to be in the presence of all you wonderful and fierce speakers. And really thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I want to give a special thanks from AMBA to Black Women Radicals and from me to Jamie. I appreciate you so much. I'm so grateful for you. And I really enjoyed planning and executing this event for you. It was a really great learning experience. And yeah, just thank you. Thank you for sharing this space with me and with Ruji and with.
Yeah, just to reiterate, thank you all so much. It was amazing. And I definitely can say I learned more, a lot more, and appreciate all the time you guys took to give such insightful answers. And thanks also to Jamie and Kulsum for putting together this beautiful event.
Yeah, I appreciate all of y'all so much. Thank you to Kusum and Aruj and all of our wonderful panelists. Y'all are popping, all right? So I really hope y'all have a great rest of your day, get some rest, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon. And, you know, solidarity today and forever. So thank y'all so, so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Such a joy to be on here with you all. I hope we get to connect again soon.
I will love that. We need it. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.